Before I begin, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. It means a lot to share this, a story that's been sitting heavy on my heart for a good long while. They say time heals all wounds, but sometimes time just gives you clarity, a clearer view of the landscape of your life and the people in it. My son, Daniel, and his wife, Susan, well, they forgot my birthday again last year. It wasn't the first time, not by a long shot. But something about that particular forgetting, the 78th one it was, settled differently in my soul. It was the straw, a seemingly small, insignificant straw, that finally broke the back of a lifetime of quiet endurance. So, I decided if they could forget me so easily, I could just as easily forget them in the one place it seemed to matter to them most. This is how I made them understand, in the only language they seemed to speak, that I wasn't finished yet, and that a mother's love, while vast, is not unconditional when faced with perpetual disregard. The house felt quieter than usual that Tuesday, my birthday. I'd woken up with that little flutter of hope, the one that stubbornly refused to die despite years of evidence to the contrary. Perhaps this year I'd thought a little foolishly. I'd baked a small lemon drizzle cake the day before, Robert's favorite, and mine too by extension of loving him so fiercely for 50 years. The scent usually filled the kitchen with warmth, with memories. But that morning, it just smelled faintly of lemons and solitude. I made my tea, sat by the window overlooking the rose garden Robert had planted, the blooms a riot of crimson and pale pink, a testament to a love that never forgot. The phone remained silent. No cheerful "Happy birthday, Mum" from Daniel, no slightly too shrill, dutiful greeting from Susan. Not even a text message from my granddaughter, Lily, who is usually pretty good with these things, though I suspected her parents were the gatekeepers of such reminders. By midday, the silence wasn't just quiet. It was a presence, heavy and suffocating. I ate a slice of the cake alone, the sweetness a stark contrast to the bitterness welling up inside me. It wasn't about the gifts or a party or grand gestures. It never had been. It was about being remembered, about feeling like you still mattered a tiny bit in the whirlwind of their busy, important lives. Lives I had, in no small part, helped build. I remembered Daniel's first steps, taken right here in this living room, his little hand gripping my finger. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up with him when he was sick, the sacrifices Robert and I had made for his education, the down payment we'd gifted them for their first overly ambitious house, money we'd earmarked for a trip to Italy we never took. We'd poured ourselves into him, into them. And for what? To be an item on a to-do list so far down it perpetually fell off the page. The hurt was an old, familiar companion, but this time, it brought with it a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a symptom of a deeper indifference, a casual cruelty that had become their norm. The roses outside nodded in the breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray wash of my feelings. I thought of Robert, how he'd always made such a fuss, a silly hat, a slightly off-key song, a single, perfect rose from the garden on my breakfast tray. The comparison was a fresh stab of pain. This house, these memories, they were built on love and remembrance. What Daniel and Susan offered felt like its antithesis. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened, a new thought, sharp and unwelcome yet undeniably present, began to form. Perhaps it was time to stop tending a garden that bore no fruit for me. The silence of that birthday stretched into the next day, and the day after that. It was a familiar pattern. Usually, about 3 or 4 days later, the phone would ring. Daniel, sounding rushed, would say, "Oh, Mum, things have been absolutely manic here. Lily had a project, Susan had that big presentation. How was your birthday? Did you do anything nice?" The apology, if it could even be called that, was always an afterthought, a hurried addendum before he launched into whatever he actually needed, usually a subtle inquiry about whether I was managing all right, which I knew was code for, "Are you still capable of living independently, so we don't have to deal with you?" Or worse, Susan would call, her voice dripping with that false sweetness that always set my teeth on edge. "Eleanor, darling, we've been meaning to call. Happy belated. You know how it is, life just gets in the way, life." As if I wasn't part of life anymore. As if my milestones were just inconvenient little bumps in their much more important road. I knew their birthdays, their anniversary, Lily's school play dates, Daniel's golf handicap. I had a calendar in my kitchen, meticulously marked, not because my memory was failing, but because those dates mattered to me. I sent cards, thoughtful little gifts I'd spend weeks picking out, trying to find something that said, "I see you, I care about you." The reciprocity was lacking. More than lacking. It was a barren wasteland. I remembered last Christmas, Susan had given me a generic bath set, the kind you pick up at the supermarket checkout. Later, I'd overheard her telling Daniel on the phone, when she thought I was napping, "Well, what do you get for someone who doesn't go anywhere or do anything?" At least it's practical. The sting of that "doesn't go anywhere or do anything" had stayed with me. I used to go places. I used to do things. With Robert. And even after he was gone, I tried. But invitations to their house became less frequent, then conditional. "Only if you're feeling up to it, Mum. We wouldn't want to tire you out." It was a slow, insidious process of being edged out, made to feel like a fragile antique best left on the shelf. This year, the belated call didn't come by day 3. Or day 4. It was a full week later when Daniel finally rang, and it wasn't even about my birthday. He needed to know if I still had the instruction manual for the old lawnmower they'd borrowed 5 years ago and never returned. When I gently reminded him it had been my birthday the previous Tuesday, there was a pause. Not a guilty pause. More of an, "Oh, was it?" pause.
Ah, right. Yes.
"Well, happy birthday, Mum." Belated, obviously. Busy week. So, about that manual. That was it. The final, brittle strand of hope snapped. It wasn't just neglect, it was an erasure. And I, Eleanor Vance, was tired of being erased. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, usually a comforting background noise, suddenly sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the time I had left to make my own mark, to write my own ending. The conversation about the lawnmower manual, or rather, the glaring omission within it, became the pivot point. It wasn't a dramatic, plate-smashing moment, but a quiet, internal shift, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. For years, I'd made excuses for them. He's busy with his career. She's overwhelmed with Lily and her own ambitions. They're young, self-absorbed, that's just how it is these days. But standing there in my kitchen, the cordless phone feeling cold in my hand after Daniel's perfunctory call, the excuses felt thin, pathetic. He was 52. She was 48. Lily was a teenager. They weren't young and foolish anymore. They were adults, making conscious choices about where to invest their time and emotional energy. And clearly, I was not a good investment. A few weeks after my non-birthday, Susan called. "Eleanor," she began, her voice a little too bright, "we were thinking, with the way property prices are going, your house must be worth a fortune now. Have you had it valued recently?" I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "No, Susan, I haven't," I replied, keeping my voice even. "It's my home, not an investment portfolio." "Well, yes, of course," she said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "But Daniel and I were just saying it's such a big place for one person. All that upkeep. We were wondering if you'd thought about downsizing? Maybe something smaller, more manageable? Closer to us, perhaps? We could help you find a lovely little apartment." The implication hung heavy in the air. Smaller, more manageable for whom? Easier for them to eventually inherit and sell, no doubt. The phrase "closer to us" was particularly galling, given their track record of barely visiting me in my current, perfectly accessible home. It was then I truly understood. They weren't just forgetting my birthday. They were waiting for me to become a problem they needed to solve, or better yet, a collection of assets they could absorb. The house, Robert's legacy, and mine, was just a number on a spreadsheet to them. My mind flashed back to a conversation Robert and I had, years ago, when Daniel was just starting his career. "We need to make sure he's always okay, Ellie," Robert had said, "but we also need to make sure he understands the value of things, not just the price." It seemed Daniel had learned the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing, least of all his own mother. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The hurt was still there, A dull ache in my chest, but alongside it, a new feeling was taking root, a steely resolve. No more, I whispered into the darkness. This is my life, my home, my legacy. And I will decide what happens to it. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life, a narrative they had tried so hard to edit into insignificance. The next morning, I made an appointment. My first call was to Sarah, my young neighbor from across the street. She was a single mother, a nurse, always kind, always checking in on me, especially after big storms or during heat waves. She'd often bring her little boy, Tom, over, and he'd help me in the garden, his bright chatter a welcome sound in the often too quiet house. I asked her if she knew a good solicitor, someone patient and understanding. Sarah, bless her, immediately thought of Monica Brewster. She helped my aunt with her will a few years back, Mrs. Vance, Sarah said. Aunt Carol said she was brilliant, really listened, you know? I did know. Or rather, I knew what it felt like not to be listened to. The name Monica Brewster sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. I thanked Sarah, her genuine warmth a balm to my bruised spirit. Finding Monica's office number was easy enough. Her practice was in the old part of town, in a distinguished-looking building that had probably housed solicitors for a century. When I called, her receptionist was polite and efficient. I simply said I needed to discuss my will and estate planning. An appointment was made for the following Tuesday. The week leading up to it was filled with a strange mixture of trepidation and anticipation. I found myself wandering through the house, touching familiar objects, Robert's old armchair, the grandfather clock in the hall that chimed the quarter hours, the photographs on the mantelpiece. Each one held a story, a memory. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a repository of my life. The thought of Daniel and Susan moving through it after I was gone, their eyes calculating square footage and resale value, filled me with a profound sadness and an even stronger determination. When Tuesday arrived, I dressed carefully in my good navy suit, the one I usually saved for weddings or funerals. It felt appropriate. I took a taxi into town, the driver a cheerful young man who insisted on helping me out of the car and right to the door of Monica Brewster's office. The office itself was understated and calming, with shelves of leather-bound books and comfortable chairs. Monica Brewster was a woman perhaps in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. As soon as she introduced herself, I remembered. "Monica," I said, a wave of recognition washing over me. "You worked with Robert, my late husband, years ago." With his business partner, Mr. Henderson, a warm smile spread across her face. "Eleanor Vance." "Of course, I remember Robert well. A true gentleman." "Please, sit down." The connection immediately put me at ease. I didn't launch into a tirade about Daniel and Susan. Instead, I started slowly, explaining my current situation, the loneliness, the feeling of being taken for granted. I spoke of Robert, of our dreams for the house, for our family. And then, I told her about the forgotten birthdays, the call about the lawnmower, Susan's unsubtle hints about downsizing. I laid it all out, not with anger, but with a quiet sorrow that I think conveyed the depth of my disappointment more effectively than any raised voice could have. Monica listened patiently, her gaze never wavering, occasionally making a soft, understanding sound. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She just let me speak until I had said everything that needed to be said. When I finally fell silent, a little teary but also strangely relieved, she nodded slowly. "Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand. More than you know, perhaps. Many people find themselves in similar, heartbreaking situations. The law provides you with the autonomy to decide how your assets are distributed. Your will is your voice, your final say. What is it you wish to do?" Her question was direct, empowering. And I knew, with absolute certainty, what my answer was. "I want to change my will, Monica," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I want to ensure that my home and everything Robert and I worked for goes where it will be valued, not just monetized." The decision, once voiced, felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Monica Brewster was the epitome of professionalism and empathy. She didn't try to dissuade me or offer platitudes about family reconciliation. Instead, she asked clarifying questions, ensuring she understood my wishes perfectly. "So, Eleanor," she began, leaning forward slightly, "your current will, I presume, leaves the bulk of your estate to Daniel?" I nodded.
Yes.
It was drawn up years ago when Robert was still alive. It seemed the natural thing to do. Our only child, a shadow of the old pain crossed my face, but I pushed it away. "Natural then, perhaps not appropriate now," Monica said softly. "So, if not Daniel and his family, who or what would you like to benefit from your estate?" This was the part one had given considerable thought to in the preceding week. It wasn't an act of spite, not entirely. It was about redirection. Redirecting the fruits of a lifetime of love and hard work towards people and causes that reflected the values Robert and I had cherished. "Firstly," I said, "there's Sarah, my neighbor. She's been more of a daughter to me these past few years than anyone. She struggles, works so hard as a nurse, and is raising her son, Tom, alone. I'd like her to have a sum, enough to make a real difference, perhaps help with a down payment on a small house of her own, or Tom's future education." Monica made a note. "A specific sum, or a percentage?" "A specific sum," I decided. "Something substantial, but not so much that it overwhelms her." "Let's say £50,000, Monica nodded. "And the house, Eleanor?" "It's a significant asset." I took a deep breath. This was the biggest decision. "The house," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Robert loved this house, this garden. I wanted to continue to be a place of joy and care. I've thought about a local children's hospice, St. Catherine's. They do wonderful work, and they're always in need of funds. I'd like the house to be sold, and the entire proceeds from the sale to go to them. Unconditionally. Monica's eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply wrote it down. "And any remaining assets?" "Savings, investments. I have a few charities I've supported quietly over the years," I continued, feeling a growing sense of purpose. "The local animal shelter, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution." Robert was a keen sailor in his youth, and a small charity that supports elderly people living alone. I'd like the remainder to be divided equally among them. I also decided to leave some specific personal items: Robert's sailing trophies to a maritime museum, my mother's jewelry to Sarah, if she would like it, or else to be sold for St. Catherine's. As I spoke, detailing my wishes, I felt a peculiar sense of peace. It was as if I was finally tidying up my life, putting everything in its proper place. Monica then explained the legal process, the need for new witnesses, the revocation of the old will. She assured me it would all be handled discreetly and efficiently. "And Daniel?" she asked gently. "Do you wish to leave him anything at all? Even a nominal sum, to show he was not forgotten in the drafting, merely intentionally excluded from a larger share?" I considered this. Part of me, the old, habituated mother part, felt a pang. But then I remembered the lawnmower manual, the casual disregard. "No," I said firmly. "Nothing. My silence in the will regarding him and his family will speak volumes. They forgot me in life. I will forget them in legacy. Perhaps a letter, though, to be given to you, Monica, to hold, explaining my reasons. Not for them. For my own peace of mind, that the wise understood by someone." Monica nodded. "That can certainly be arranged. Over the next few weeks, Monica and I finalized the new will. I signed it in her office, with her secretary and a junior solicitor as witnesses. The pen felt steady in my hand. Each signature was a declaration of independence, a quiet act of rebellion against years of being undervalued. Walking out of her office that day, the sun seemed a little brighter, the air a little fresher. I had taken back control. I had ensured that Robert's and my life's work would nurture kindness and care, not fuel entitlement and greed. Life, after changing the will, continued much as before on the surface, but internally, I felt a profound shift. A quiet confidence settled over me. The constant, low hum of anxiety about Daniel and Susan, their expectations, their subtle pressures, simply faded away. I still saw them, occasionally. Daniel would call, usually when he needed something, advice about a leaky tap he couldn't be bothered to call a plumber for, or to ask if I remembered where some old family documents were stored, documents he'd likely need for his own financial planning. Susan would sometimes accompany him on a fleeting visit, her eyes invariably scanning the house, lingering on the antique bureau in the hallway or the silver tea service Robert's parents had given us. I started to see these interactions with a new, almost detached clarity. Their words, their actions, were no longer barbs that could wound me. They were simply observations. Data points confirming the wisdom of my decision. One Sunday afternoon, about a month after I'd signed the new will, they turned up unannounced. "We were in the area," Daniel said, a little too casually. Susan was already peering into the dining room. "Thought we'd pop in and see how you are, Mum." The area was a good 40-minute drive from their home, so I knew this wasn't a casual pop-in. After the usual pleasantries, during which Susan managed to comment on how the garden was looking a bit wild, it wasn't. It was lovingly tended, just not to her minimalist, soulless standards. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mum," he began, "Susan and I have been talking about this place." He gestured vaguely around the living room. "It's a lot for you. We've been looking at some lovely new retirement developments. Secure, all the amenities other people your age. Managed care packages available," Susan chimed in, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It would give us such peace of mind knowing you were somewhere purpose-built." I listened patiently, sipping my tea. The old Eleanor would have felt a surge of panic, of being managed, of being pushed out. The new Eleanor felt only a calm certainty. "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said, my voice mild. "But I'm perfectly happy here. This is my home. Robert and I built our life here. I have no intention of leaving." Daniel looked surprised, then a little irritated. "But Mum, be realistic. What if something happens? What if you fall?" "I have Sarah across the street," I replied evenly. "And I have my emergency call button, which you so kindly and expensively insisted I get last year." I didn't add that I suspected the insistence was more about assuaging their guilt than genuine concern. Susan exchanged a quick, frustrated glance with Daniel. "Well, we just think you should consider it, Eleanor. For your own good. And frankly," she added, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "this house could fund a very comfortable place for you, with plenty left over." There it was. The financial angle. Always the financial angle. "My finances are perfectly in order, Susan, thank you," I said, a little more firmly this time. "And this house will be dealt with according to my wishes. When the time comes." I saw a flicker of something in Daniel's eyes. Was it greed? Or just annoyance that I wasn't proving as malleable as he'd hoped? They didn't stay much longer after that. The atmosphere had cooled considerably. As I showed them to the door, Daniel paused. "Just think about it, Mum. We only want what's best for you. I know you do, dear," I said, though we both knew we had very different definitions of what's best. Watching their car pull away, I didn't feel sad. I felt vindicated. They had no idea. They continued to underestimate me, to see me as a problem to be managed or an asset to be liquidated. And I continued to live my life, on my own terms, holding my secret close, like a comforting warmth against the autumn chill of their indifference. I spent more time with Sarah and Tom, tended my roses, and reread Robert's old letters, his love a steadfast presence in the quiet rooms of our home. A few months later, as winter began to set in, an opportunity arose for me to subtly reinforce my newfound boundaries and for them to reveal, yet again, their true colors. Daniel called one evening, his voice unusually strained. "Mum, we have a bit of a cash flow problem." I waited, saying nothing. He stumbled on. "It's just, Lily's school fees for next term are higher than we anticipated, and a couple of my investments haven't paid out as expected. We're in a bit of a tight spot." I could almost hear Susan in the background, prompting him. So he finally got to the point. "I was wondering if you might be able to help us out? Just a loan, of course. We'd pay you back as soon as things stabilize." In the past, I would have immediately agreed, my heartstrings pulled by the thought of Lily, my only grandchild, being affected. I would have dipped into my savings, the money Robert and I had carefully put aside for our old age, for emergencies. But this time was different. I thought of Monica's calm advice, of the carefully considered bequests in my new will. I thought of St. Catherine's Hospice, of Sarah and Tom. Their needs were real, their gratitude genuine. "Daniel," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties. But my financial situation is, well, it's carefully managed for my own needs. I'm not in a position to offer large loans at the moment." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost picture his face, the disbelief, the dawning irritation. "Not in a position," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Mum, this house alone is worth a fortune. You're sitting on a gold mine." "It's my home, Daniel," I reiterated patiently. "Not a bank. And its value is something I intend to manage according to my own plans." "Your own plans?" he scoffed. "What plans could you possibly have that are more important than helping your own family, your own granddaughter?" The guilt trip was laid on thick, but it didn't stick. "Not anymore. My plans are my own, Daniel," I said, a touch of steel in my voice now. "And I'm afraid I can't help you this time. You'll have to find another solution." He muttered something about me being unreasonable, selfish even, before abruptly ending the call. Selfish. After a lifetime of sacrifice, that was their assessment. The irony was almost laughable. Susan didn't call for weeks after that. When she finally did, it was a curt, formal invitation to Lily's school Christmas concert. No warmth, no pretense of affection. Just a duty call. I attended the concert, of course. Lily was lovely, playing her violin with a sweet, if slightly nervous, proficiency. But during the reception afterwards, Daniel was distant, and Susan barely acknowledged me beyond a tight-lipped nod. Their disappointment and resentment were palpable. It didn't upset me as it once would have. Instead, it solidified my resolve. My decision had been the right one. They saw me as a resource, and when that resource proved unavailable, their superficial affection evaporated. This incident, this clear demonstration of their priorities, was another layer of confirmation, another small stone paving the path to my own peace of mind. I was no longer their safety net, their emergency fund. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman with her own plans, her own legacy to secure. And that felt remarkably good. The process of finalizing everything with Monica had been remarkably straightforward, yet profound. After signing the new will, I took her advice and wrote that letter. It wasn't addressed to Daniel or Susan. They wouldn't understand it, or worse, they'd twist its meaning. It was addressed to my executor, to be opened by Monica upon my death, perhaps to be filed with the will if she saw fit. In it, I didn't rail against my son and daughter-in-law. I simply explained my reasoning with as much grace and clarity as I could muster. I wrote about Robert, about the life we built, the values we shared. I wrote about the quiet hurt of being forgotten, the gradual erosion of feeling valued, not for my money or my house, but for myself. I explained that my bequests were not acts of revenge, but affirmations of what I held dear: kindness, compassion, community, and the importance of remembering those who enrich our lives. I wrote about Sarah's unassuming goodness, the joy Tom's visits brought me, the vital work of the charities I'd chosen. I wanted it on record, somewhere, that my decisions came from a place of considered reflection, not bitterness. Though, if I were truly honest with myself, a small, justifiable sliver of bitterness had certainly been the catalyst. Once the letter was written, sealed, and delivered to Monica's keeping, a great sense of calm descended upon me. It was done. My house was in order, in every sense of the word. I focused on living. I found joy in the small routines. My morning tea in the garden, listening to the birds, my weekly trips to the library, long, rambling phone calls with my sister, who lived in Scotland and always remembered my birthday. I invited Sarah and Tom over for tea more often. Tom, with his innocent questions and boundless energy, was a tonic. Sarah and I would chat while he played, and I found in her a companionship I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. She never asked for anything, never pried, but her quiet presence was a comfort. I even started a small new project, cataloging Robert's collection of antique maps. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and focus, and I loved it. It connected me to him, to his passions. Daniel and Susan remained distant after the loan incident. Their calls became even more infrequent, their visits practically non-existent. When they did interact, there was an undercurrent of resentment, a coolness that was a stark contrast to their previous, albeit superficial, warmth. It was as if, by refusing to be their financial backstop, I had fundamentally failed in my maternal duty in their eyes. Oddly, their distance brought me a strange kind of peace. I was no longer anxiously awaiting their calls, no longer bracing myself for their subtle demands or criticisms. I was free of their expectations. My life, my home, my time, they were mine again, to fill as I saw fit. I was living my final chapter on my own terms, with a quiet dignity they couldn't touch. The knowledge of the will, safely lodged with Monica, was a silent guardian of that dignity, a guarantee that my ultimate wishes would be respected, that my legacy would reflect my true self, not the diminished version they had tried to create. As the seasons turned, I found myself reflecting more, not with regret, but with a sense of completion. I imagined sometimes the day my will would be read. I didn't dwell on it morbidly, but rather as one might contemplate the closing of a finely crafted book. I knew there would be shock. Daniel and Susan had, for so long, operated under the assumption that my house, my savings, everything Robert and I had worked for, was their inevitable inheritance. Theirs by right, it seemed, regardless of their own efforts or affections. The thought of their faces, when Monica Brewster calmly and professionally read out the true disposition of my estate, brought a faint, wry smile to my lips. It wouldn't be a dramatic courtroom scene, just a quiet office, perhaps, with Daniel's bluster slowly deflating, Susan's carefully constructed composure cracking. I could picture Daniel's initial disbelief, then his outrage. But that's impossible. She wouldn't. There must be some mistake. She was my mother. He would feel betrayed, cheated of what he considered his due. He would likely accuse me of being senile, manipulated, though Monica's careful documentation would swiftly disprove any such claims. Susan, I imagined, would be icily furious, her mind already calculating the financial implications, the loss of the gold mine she'd so eagerly anticipated. Perhaps they would try to contest it, to drag my name and memory through the mud in a desperate attempt to overturn my clearly stated wishes. Let them try. Monica was thorough. The will was ironclad. More than the financial shock, I hoped, perhaps naively, that a deeper realization might eventually dawn on them. A glimmer of understanding about why. That their casual neglect, their consistent forgetfulness, their transparent greed had consequences far beyond a missed birthday card or an unreturned phone call. That relationships, even with family, require tending. That love and respect are not entitlements but earned. I imagined Sarah's quiet surprise, then her tears of gratitude. That £50,000 would be life-changing for her and Tom, a security she richly deserved. I pictured the directors of St. Catherine's Hospice, the animal shelter, the RNLI, the elderly support charity, receiving unexpected bequests, funds that would allow them to continue their vital work, to bring comfort and aid to others. That was where my legacy would truly live on, in acts of kindness, in the support of compassionate causes, in the lives touched by a gift freely given, from a heart that remembered what it was to care. This wasn't about punishing Daniel and Susan, not really. It was about choosing to honor the values Robert and I lived by. Choosing to invest in kindness rather than entitlement. Choosing to be remembered not as a forgotten old woman, but as someone who, in the end, made her own choices, clearly and decisively. My final years were lived in a state of quiet contentment that had eluded me for so long. The knowledge of my meticulously planned will acted as an invisible shield, deflecting the anxieties and resentments that had once plagued me. Daniel and Susan, after a few more half-hearted attempts to engage with me on their terms, usually around holidays, with an eye, I suspected, on maintaining appearances or perhaps hoping for a deathbed change of heart, largely faded into the background of my life. Their absence, once a source of pain, became a source of peace. The house, no longer a future asset in their minds, or so I assumed from their cooling interest, felt entirely my own again. Its rooms were filled not with the ghosts of their expectations, but with the warm presence of Robert's memory, with the scent of baking, the rustle of book pages, and the cheerful sounds of Tom's occasional visits. Sarah became an even dearer friend. We shared cups of tea, gardening tips, and life stories. She never pried into my family affairs, though I sensed she understood more than she let on. Her unassuming kindness was a daily reminder of the good in the world, the simple human connections that truly matter. I made sure Monica Brewster had updated contact details for Sarah and for all the charities. I even added a small addendum to my letter, expressing my deep gratitude for Sarah's friendship, hoping it would bring her some comfort to know how much she had meant to me. The day I passed, I hope it was peaceful, perhaps in my sleep, in Robert's armchair by the window, overlooking the roses. I hope Sarah was the one to find me, not for her sake, but for mine, so my last human connection on this earth was one of genuine affection. The reading of the will, as I had envisioned, would have been a shock to Daniel and Susan. Their carefully laid plans, their assumptions of entitlement, all dismantled by a few pages of legal documentation and my unwavering signature. I imagine their anger, their frantic calls to their own solicitors, their bitter recriminations. They would see it as the ultimate betrayal, the act of a bitter, vengeful old woman. They would never understand that it was, in fact, an act of profound self-respect, a reclamation of my own narrative. They would be left with the stark reality that their neglect had a price far greater than the monetary value of my estate. They would be left with the knowledge that they had so thoroughly undervalued their mother that she had, in the end, written them out of her life's final chapter. My true legacy, however, would be flourishing elsewhere. In Sarah's newfound security, in Tom's future opportunities, in the comfort provided by St. Catherine's Hospice, in the wagging tails at the animal shelter, in the lifeboats launching to save others, in the support given to other elderly souls who might feel forgotten. That is where the love and hard work of Eleanor and Robert Vance would continue to make a difference. And for me, Eleanor, there would finally be peace. A quiet, unshakable peace, knowing that I had stayed true to myself, that my life had meaning, and that my final act was one of deliberate, considered intention. They forgot my birthday, so I rewrote my ending. And in doing so, I found a measure of justice and a lasting serenity that was all my own.